And it's interesting that Abraham believed God could raise the dead before God had ever once done it. Now, we can look back and we can see numerous times in both the Old Testament and the New Testament where God raised people from the dead back to life again. But at the time that Abraham believed God, that had never happened. God had never raised anybody from the dead before. This was unprecedented. The idea had never crossed anyone's mind that God would do such a thing. So when was it in Abraham's life that he believed that God would raise the dead? I'm glad you asked. Hold your place here in Romans chapter 4 and turn over to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Stick something in Romans 4 because we're going back there, but turn to Hebrews chapter 11. When was it in Abraham's life that he believed that God would raise the dead? Right here in Hebrews chapter 11, look down in beginning in verse number 17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. People imagine Abraham going up on Mount Moriah with his son, struggling over God's command to kill his son, taking deep breaths, really wrestling over whether he's going to kill his son like God has commanded him to do, and just having this crisis of faith as he deals with this. Okay, that's the Hollywood version. How often does Hollywood ever get Bible stories right? This passage right here in Hebrews chapter 11 says that God told Abraham to sacrifice the child, and it says that in the verse it says, Abraham knew God's promise that in Isaac would thy seed be called, that all these innumerable descendants that are going to be like the sand and like the stars were all going to come through this promised child Isaac, who was miraculously conceived. And now God is telling Abraham to sacrifice this child, and Isaac is nowhere near becoming a father of anybody yet, let alone a multitude like the stars of heaven. So if Abraham plunges ahead, how is God still going to fulfill his promise through Isaac? What was going on in Abraham's mind right here? Well, this passage tells us what's going on in his mind. It says that Abraham accounted that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. Abraham expected to slay his son, but he knew that God had promised to send a multitude through that very slain son. And Abraham thought, okay, God's going to raise him from the dead. That's what he assumed God would do. He had no doubt that he and the lad would return from Mount Moriah where he was being offered. And he believed, and that's what, back to Romans 4:17. Back in Romans 4:17, that's what Paul is talking about there in Romans 4:17 when he says that Abraham believed God who quickeneth the dead. He believed that the promised child who was miraculously born would be slain on Mount Moriah and then returned to life. And figuratively speaking, that's exactly what happened. He received his son, Isaac, back from the dead in a figure, it says, from which he received him in a figure. And he believed that through him would be born an innumerable host like the sand of the seashore and like the stars of heaven, children of faith from all the nations of the world. That's the faith whereby Abraham was declared righteous. And it's the same faith that makes us righteous as well. I think that's incredible. The insight that God gave Abraham about the gospel, a miracle child being born, who would be slain and would be raised again. And through him, all nations would become children of God the Father, of whom Father Abraham is a picture in this scenario.